prior to getting into the residential sales agreement specifics, I just sort of wanted to give you some general practices that are happening. I have 3 or 4 rules that you sort of have to live by. One is that all paperwork that's mutually agreed upon or is sale failed or is rejected all have to be turned in and turned in within 3 days of the determination that that document either is not going to be used in the transaction but is partially signed, or it's mutually agreed upon. So you have 3 days from the time you get to that to get it turned in. We have 4 days to review it. So if you have any problems with that, let me know. We're probably going to start enforcing that a little further than we have in the past. We're getting so much paperwork in late that it's becoming an issue and it's out of compliance with the state. Okay. Let's see. Let's keep going. It's also recommended that you keep a log of your conversations with your clients and notes of the transaction, and they should be submitted with all the paperwork so we have it on file. Oftentimes you go back, have a problem, and you have no notes, so you really have no knowledge or proof that you had a conversation or didn't have a conversation. It's important to have that in writing. There's nothing better than going into a court action and having a full documentation of what the issues are, what you told them, what you didn't tell them, and the time base. Most of the time you'll take out any of your adversaries in those cases. So I highly recommend it. I don't care whether you keep it just chronologically through your day or you keep it by individual client. Either way works. Just something that will denote the conversations and what you talked about, because there's nothing like being able to say, yes, but we talked about this, this, and this on this date, so you knew. And especially where, well, so many times your client or the other agent may have a memory that lapsed that doesn't quite remember it all. So I strongly would urge you to do that. The other, one of the last 2 issues is be the source of the source. Don't be the source of information, be the source of the source. For example, if you have a question on the preliminary title report, make sure you raise the issue, but you direct your clients to escrow and have them explain what the issue and how it affects them. Planning, land use and planning, you want to make sure that you're directing them to the planning department. You're not getting the information from the planning department. Every time that'll get you in trouble. And the third quick rule is I go by a set of rules that call the double D's. First is disclose, disclose, disclose. And the second is document, document, document. Those 2 things will keep you out of an awful lot of the problems that we have. Most of the problems is a seller or buyer says, I didn't know. And you should have told me. If you're documenting it, you'll have be able to document that you have that conversation. If there's ever a doubt on disclosure, you run on the disclosure side. Certainly, and also you can, on the specific ones, you can give me a call or email or drop by and we'll chat a little bit about it. Another quick issue for your place to look is there's a document that's on your thumb drive that was given to you at onboarding. If you need the information, be glad to send you the file again, but it's called best practices. And it sort of takes those oddball issues and sort of describes what to do. Multiple offers, how you want to handle it, what you handle with death, a death in the family, what you have to do to document, general inspection, feasibility studies, make sure you're documenting it. many times you'll see that there's a phrasing in the sales agreement that says that the buyer or the seller are to do something by this date. It doesn't say, and most agents just don't follow through, but you need to follow through and say, at that date, buyer is entitled to his earnest money back, or what happens. You know, there's one thing of saying when you're in default. The second is what happens when you are in default, where you have not acted properly. So I would encourage you to add that into your sales agreement. Referrals, inspections, then there's some just documentation rules. And it really is a pretty good document that goes through and just talks about all those little crazy questions you have or you want to look at that you might not think of. HOAs, you know, making sure that you have your buyer has gone through and looked at the reserve study on it. Verifying deeded parking. Sometimes they'll say, yeah, you got space number 29, but nobody verified that they really legally have a space. Is it assigned and can it be reassigned by the HOA? You got to check that. And just anyway, it's just a series of just all sorts of, you know, odds and ends as they've gone past me and what we need to do to try to take a position of it. Anybody have any questions before we go to the sales agreement? Good. I don't hear anything, so let's go forward. Let's see. Okay. First, also on your thumb drive that you got, there's a summary of documents. There's one for sales, and there's also one for listings. And it just lists the basic forms that are both required and those additional forms that are available to you. For example, for vacant land, condos, bank-owned, transferring funds, all have different advisories out there that you can give your client that'll help them take information. We also have a multi-informational disclosure form that takes care of a lot of the little forms that we have. So rather than doing the siding, the water, smoke and carbon monoxide and home warranty disclosures, you could do it all in one document, which is the informational disclosure document. There's an escalator clause, but anyway, it's a summary. It's sort of done by situation rather than by numeric number of the form. So you sort of can go in and look at some stuff and see what it is there based on what you're trying to get accomplished in the transaction. But that's available both for the listing side and also the sales side, the buyer's side for you. And it just lays it out for you to it. Let's start getting into the transaction itself. First, there's a litany of pages of information for you. The ZIP forms has in it and published by OREF a summary of all the forms they have, which is similar to the one I just showed you. This gives you a little more detail, but it probably doesn't have the same organizational position and the same overview that the other one will have. The other is probably a quicker guide. This one tends to be a little more detailed in where or what to find things. But just so you know, it's there. So you have research to it. Let's go on and let's start a transaction. We're going to get there in a second. This is longer than I thought. Okay. Your first required document is the Oregon Real Estate Initial Agency pamphlet. This this is to be given at the first or initial contact with your people. And no, if you're a party, you don't have to give them one of these. But but your first substantive contact, rather, you've talked to somebody at the party, they say, I want to buy or sell some real estate. When you first time you sit down and start talking about that subject, this has to be part of what your presentation is to them. And it really talks about what agency does. It doesn't have to be initialed or anything. It's just, but you do have to prove that you got it, gave it to them. One of the ways to do that is the multi-informational disclosure form has a space on it that says they have received it. So that's another use, another thing it tackles in there, so you don't have to be initialing these as we've done in the past to make sure that you can document that they received it. It's part of that as a disclosure. It also talks about the definitions of what happens if seller's agent, where you're representing the seller, or the buyer's agent, who represents the buyer only, or disclosed limited agency, where the agent is representing both, or in some cases, it's two different agents but they're both from our market center. And in that case, the individual agents represent their individual clients, but because I supervise both agents, then I'm a disclosed limited agent to your client, and I'll show you. And that, by the way, dual representation, that you could do that where it's your listing, and you're writing an offer on your own listing, but it also can happen in multiple offers where you in fact have two buyers who want to bid on the same property, and then you're in a disclosed limited agency because you can't share some of the things you normally could share or would share or not, or try to find out about it, right? A client, for example, if one of the parties said, I'm going to make an offer of 350, and but I'll go up to 400,000. In a normal circumstance where it's two different agents, you would not disclose that, and you'd be required anything you found out to give your client. In this case, they'd be restricted from giving that information to their client. That if it was listing agent, you could not give that to, in fact, that information that the buyer may have given you. So it's a question of what kind of information you give and can give, and your limitations to that. And they have to approve that, by the way, your clients, that they're willing to do that. And it's all spelled out. This is probably spelled out better than the disclosed limited agency document. So this is a real good document to speak to that and sort of set the tone for the whole thing. While I'm thinking about it, I highly recommend that you sit down with your clients, whether it's a listing or a buyer, you sit down with them prior to writing an offer or accepting an offer or reviewing offers, but sit down prior and go through the paperwork, because what will happen is very simply is that when you get an offer in, or the buyer has seen a house, they love it, they'll call you and say, gee, I want to place this offer. I want to place this offer on this house. I need to do it now. So you do a DocuSign document, you send it over to them and show them where to initial, but they haven't read it. And they probably won't, because they're so anxious to look at to get the house, that they just start going through it, initialing everything. So my suggestion is that's fine. I don't think you're going to change that. But what you can change is when you first sit down with them, to sit down with them and go through the transaction. By the way, while we're talking about sitting down and looking through the paperwork, I strongly urge you, in fact, most of the time I give you homework, and I will give you homework now that I'm thinking about it, but I'll usually have you do it before the class, is to read the entire sales agreement, all 11 pages. and read it 3 times, line by line. If you don't understand something, then in fact stop by and see me, look it up, however, but you should be able to have read the whole thing. You won't remember the whole thing. It's next to impossible. I certainly don't. I always go back and look at it when I have a problem, just simply so I'm sure of the advice I'm giving you. Okay. So that's the pamphlet that you're initially. Then the other required document is disclosed limited agency, and when that talked about what happens if, in fact, it's a sale within inside the company. Now remember, each one of our franchises is a separate company. Portland Premier is separate from Keller Williams Realty. Elite is separate from Keller Williams Sunset and Keller Williams Professionals. They're all separate companies. So remember that that's the mode. They just have similar names to you, and they're franchised to the same company, but they're different companies, so to speak. Okay, let's get into the sales agreement, the fun part. And when I present this to the client, it's going to be very similar to how I present it to you. I don't read every word to them, but I give them the general gist of what each section means and how it may or may not apply to them. And what I usually, when I first sit down with them, I usually say, first we're going to talk about agency, and you'll see it on several different documents. The first one is the agency pamphlet, which I gave you when we first sat down. The other is the disclosed limited agency. And then we come back, it's on the top of the sales agreement. So obviously we as an industry feel to make sure you understand who's representing who is very important to you. So lines 1 through 7, or actually 1 through 12, talk about agency, and it talks about who each of us represent. In this particular case, I'm writing an offer on another property. Sorry, I got it right. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm writing an offer on the property that's mentioned further down the page, and this agent is the representative of the seller and all of his information. So in each case, it tells who you're representing and what your company contact information is. All this is available at our MLS so you can get all the company number, and also all the licenses and everything else is all available, so you can complete that. The only thing that's wrong with this right here, just so you know how easy it is I didn't check buyer exclusive agency versus buyer and seller disclosed limited agency. So I didn't disclose what kind of an agent I was and who I represented. And I didn't check the box for the seller's agent representing exclusively the seller's agent. So just make sure you check one or the other. And if you're a listing agent, just make sure that the other agent who's presenting an offer checks one of the boxes too. And then both parties will sign, indicating that they are acknowledging agency and who's representing who. Any questions or anything out there? Have I put you all to sleep yet? Yeah, probably. This is sometimes not the most exciting stuff, but it's stuff you really, really need and can be fun to work with.
Mike, I have a question. This
Yes.
is Jan.
Hey, Jan.
If we get a offer in and the agent has not checked one of those boxes, do we have to fix it for an addendum?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
The thing what you should do, and in most offers, you write a counter offer anyway. Very few do you just accept as is. And in that case, if it's not checked, you simply do as part of your counter offer, you just say, you know, on lines such and such and such and such, you know, Mike Hobson represents the buyer, John Smith represents the seller. And those boxes are appropriately checked in lines 1 through 12 for
got
something.
it.
So reference where it is and what that change is. And it's just, as I say, anything I ever write, there's always some change to just clarify a detail or change a price or whatever. Okay, going down a little further, just went down a little too far. You talk about it describes the buyer, the seller, and what they're buying. You should have both the address and some form of legal description of it. Tax ID, a descriptor from that says tax lot number 43 in some particular neighborhood, but you need to identify it both as address and also by the tax lot or tax ID or some sort of descriptor to make sure that you're buying it, the right property. Then you're coming down and you're saying, gee, what is the offer? Okay, well, gee, in this case, my buyer's writing an offer for $595,000. He's giving you earnest money of $5,000, and he's taking a loan out for $555,000. So that means he needs to come in with $35,000 of additional down payment, because this should be always your loan amount, the bottom line there, and that should be the sales price that you're offering. And these are the two things that are adding up together the amount of the total down payment. So that in this case, you're putting $40,000 down and doing a loan for $555,000. Almost always, it'll be a deed. It will not be a contract. If you're looking at the transaction and it's going to be seller carried contract or whatever, I'll tell you, it's a complicated process. Has gotten a lot more complicated over the last 10 years and restrictive. So if you're looking at a contract, whether it be a first or a second, come see me and let's write it together and take a look at it, and we'll go through it. I enjoy them because they're fun, but they're also significantly more difficult. And not every agent understands all the nuances, so don't just automatically trust the other agent who may or may not know what he's talking about. Okay, and then don't forget, buyer and seller need to initial every page. Okay, we good there? Yes, so. Okay. Let's see. Let's talk about personal property. This describes what fixtures are, and it describes every piece of it. If you have something different, whether you're excluding a bush or a lamp or something else, you have to describe it. But essentially, anything that's attached to the house becomes a fixture. You get into quandaries, areas of conflict can be wall-mounted TVs, refrigerators, stoves. By the way, stoves, because most of them you plug in, is personal property. So even though most people leave the stove, it's something that it can be debatable. And usually what usually happens is that because everybody assumes that the stove's going with it, that then they get to the end, the seller has all of a sudden been forced into a corner for something, and they get mad at each other. Next thing you know, they didn't leave the stove, which the buyer assumed, as did the agent. But guess what? Unless it's written in there, you have nothing to enforce. Wall-mounted TVs, brackets. I mean, you could have made the case that the TV is personal property because it could be lifted off the brackets, but the brackets go with the house. Hot tubs, even the hardwired ones, sometimes can be debatable of whether it does or doesn't go to the house. Certainly shelving. So I would urge you, if you have anything that you want or don't want, you make sure you're explicit in this area so there's a clear understanding. I would urge you to be over descriptive rather than under descriptive, because sooner or later, if you're not descriptive enough, you end up buying somebody a refrigerator or a stove or something because there was a misunderstanding. And I'm not real high on you guys spending money for somebody else's stove or what it be. So that just sort of, these two paragraphs describe what goes with the house, what doesn't go with the house. And as I say, just make sure you're explicit. That's always a fairly active set of paragraphs when it comes into problems. Okay, financing. This just talks about how you're going to finance and how much money goes where, transactions. I mean, yeah, an example is that there's something, it asks you essentially, are there anything that is different than a normal loan? And here in this particular one, this transaction is subject to receiving funds from the husband's IRA and a gift from Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who I would assume would be the mother-in-law or father-in-law combo. But anything other than that $355,000 coming from any, or the deposit coming from any place other than funds on hand. If you don't have the funds on hand and it's subject to something else happening, you're required to in fact disclose that to the seller because it's part of the offer. It makes it stronger or weaker or whatever, but it's part of the seller's decision process in looking at the offer, how strong is the offer is. It also talks about whether it be, if it's a cash, looking for verification of funds, and it's to be submitted with, if they haven't submitted this proof already with the offer, they need to have it, in this case, 5 business days. And then you also come down and describe the type of loan you have. It's a federal VA, or and this just talks about sellers not to agree to pay any of the buyer's non-allowable VAs. And what I would urge with the different types of loans is that sit down with a lender, let them go through the entire process with you of the same house. What's a VA look like? What's an FHA look like? What is a conventional look like? And have them side by side. Most lenders will do that for you. More than happy to sit down with you and then ask, what's the difference in it? And all of a sudden you'll start seeing, well, this one's more expensive, but for example, FHA is a little more expensive than a conventional loan, but it's a little more flexible than a conventional loan and has higher positions for somebody who may not have the same credit score. They're a little more lenient in that way. And by the way, once you have described how you're going to do the loan and from what lender, right? So if you get a pre-approval letter from one company, that's what you're saying, the lender you're going with. So any change to that has to be approved by the seller. For example, you might have a case where we get a buyer decides they're going to give you a pre-approval letter from from Guild Mortgage, for example, but then the buyer goes forward, gets his offer accepted, and then accepted. All of a sudden, the buyer sits down and says, "Gee, I can go with an online vendor or mortgage broker and get it 10% cheaper. I'm going to switch." Well, if you're going to switch, you have to give the seller notice and they have to approve it. And the reason for very simple is the seller has accepted the offer based on who the lender is too. If it's Guild Mortgage, they're right here in town. I mean, worst off is you go down and march down and sit in somebody's office. An online lender, you know, many people have a little less confidence in them. So they need a little more hand holding and want to sit in front of a mortgage broker or whatever. And the seller takes it based on that premise, that it's more accessible of a loan versus some guy in cyberspace saying yes or no to somebody. So if you're going to change to something like that, the seller has to approve it. If you're going to change loan programs, all of a sudden you'd have a conventional loan and the lender says, "Oh, gee, I can't get you into conventional," but FHA will allow you the credit score to allow you to do that. So we're going to change to an FHA. The seller needs to approve that. I think one attorney said something along the lines of, "You dance with the partner that you came in with." So you have the lender that you've said you were going to have, and if you're going to change partners, you need to have approval of the other person or the other client. Okay. We talked about that. This just talks about representation regarding financing, which is a part of what we just talked about. And it's in a little more detail. You should read that individually. That's right. Contingency, fire representation. Okay. Insurance buyers encouraged to properly verify the availability and cost for insurance. My suggestion is also on this one is there's such a thing called the Clue report. It's very much like it's essentially, it's sort of like a credit report, but from an insurance point of view. The issue with it is very simple, and the reason that only the seller can get it. You can't get it as a buyer's agent. But what you want to do is put in your stipulations that the seller is to provide a Clue report, buyer to accept or reject findings of when reviewing the Clue report. And they say it's like a credit report, except what it does is it talks about what has happened to you in the last 5 years. Because what happens with insurance is they allow you essentially 3 strikes. The first claim, they may or may not change your rate, but no big deal. The second one, they probably raise your rates. The third claim within the 5-year period, and they probably don't issue you insurance where it gets real expensive. And it runs with the property. What that means is, say the seller had 2 claims. One was a roof that blew apart, and the other was water in their crawl space from a big storm. But 2 issue claims. Buyer buys the property. He finds that he ends up in himself in a situation that he has a claim. goes to make the claim, but this is the third claim that's on that property in the last 5 years. So they take care of it and then tell them they're dropping it. I mean, they're not, you can't buy insurance. The only insurance you can get is more expensive insurance because he inherited the first two things on his record, so to speak. So it's always good to know, have you had any claims in the last 5 years? Or and if you have, how many? So you know what you have left on that. If all of a sudden you find they tell you've had 2 or 3 maybe, you know if you make a claim, you got a real problem because you're not going to get insurance most likely to it. So words to the wise, I think it's important, and it's probably used very rarely to ask for it. So the other agent may sort of balk at it, but it's something your buyer should see or have at least the option of. If he's had the option, this is one of those things where if you're going through this, asking him to fill out things, and he decides not to have this particular, get this or whatever, you need to make note of it so that in case something ever comes up, you have that ability to seller carried financing. Some of these you just don't do. The one up here it's descriptor for seller carried contracts. There is an advisory for it. There's also some specific forms for it. It only comes, as I say, it doesn't come up an awful lot anymore, but you may see it, and sometimes you see it seller carried back seconds. And the real issue is in those, there can be some room to abuse to it. So sometimes, and if you ever hear the word Texas earnest money, that's what this is, because it can be, because it forces the price up, and the lender, and that's all in a second, but the value is different. You're forcing it up higher than it really is. Anyway, that's the general, but come and see me. We could chat and go through it. Title insurance. The important thing for you is the preliminary title report that you get 1 week after putting a transaction together. Make sure you read it. Make sure you advise your clients to seek either legal counsel or to go ahead and have them call escrow. You don't want to be the source of the information. You want to be the source of the source. My new phrase for the year. But just make sure that they're getting out and looking at it. Make sure, what I usually do is when I receive it, they should receive it and you should receive it both at the same time. I usually send a copy of it to my buyers or sellers and just simply say, gee, I know a copy was just sent to you. I just wanted to make sure you received it. And I send another copy of it just to ensure that they've received it. And you want to look for liens that are maybe more than the price of the house, just any type of crazy liens on the house. It'll show you all those records. Most of the liens get paid off at closing, no big deal. But all of a sudden you find out that the balance of the 2 main liens on the property, first and the second, are greater value than what they're selling. Then you may have a problem in clearing title, unless they can bring cash to the table. And just by the way, just because it says there's a $30,000 lien for a second, doesn't mean, it doesn't tell you how much of it's paid off and how much up. I mean, there could be only a couple thousand left on the lien, on the note, so it's no big deal. Or there could be they've only had it for 2 years, and it could be a very big deal because they owe the full amount, and that puts them over the price of the house. Anybody got any questions while I'm rolling here?
Mike, we had a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay, yeah. I haven't gotten to the chat. I apologize.
Yeah, a couple of questions about the clue. Like, how do you, is clue, is it CLUE is the spelling on that? And where can we go to get that? And what's the cost?
Only the seller can request it.
Okay. And did you
Okay.
request that from title?
There shouldn't be an expense for it, but they have to ask it. You'll find that you may get some pushback from the insurance agency or agent because it's not often, that people ask for it, and it's only because we as an industry haven't become attuned to it. But I think it's something you just put it in the sales agreement, seller to obtain property clue report for past 5 years.
Gotcha. And the seller can get that from their insurance company.
Yep.
Oh, perfect.
Absolutely.
Okay. Cool.
Yep. Easy to get. All you have to do is ask for it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, and you may get some pushback because it's not well known, but I think it's been my favorite one this year. That scares the hell out of me. So, any other questions there? Okay, let's march on. We talked about title. Let's talk about inspections. Okay.
Mike,
Yes.
I have a question. Am I right that the default for how closing costs are shared is that the seller pays for all the title fees, and then the seller and buyer split down the middle the escrow fees?
Yep.
Uh-huh.
That would be the default. Buyer, it's a negotiated position who pays for title insurance. Typically, you end up with a seller paying for title insurance, or not paying for it, but also, the title company. You'll find listing agents are probably pretty sensitive to using their title company. They're all regulated by the insurance commissioner, so all fees are pretty close to the same. So it just becomes a personal taste a little bit. I know I get real sensitive, and I will counter offer back just on title company alone, just because I feel that strongly and I'm not confident with the person I use. And it's usually not one to argue about.
So if you don't state anything in that section of the sale agreement, then it's understood that the default applies.
Yeah, if you don't change anything, whatever the default is.
Mm-hmm.
To it.
And another question I asked Mike was that I was under the impression that you can't sell a residence in Oregon without a stove, a working stove in place.
No,
And
that may be a lender issue. It's not a legal issue that I'm aware of.
Okay, a lender issue.
It's personal property. And while we're sort of there, the other issue is just because it's included in the listing agreement doesn't mean it's included in the mutual sales agreement. Because what's in the listing is an advertisement for a property at, say, $499 and the stove is included. Well, it comes down to accepting an offer and they didn't write the stove in, and
You better be more diligent about that. Right?
Absolutely, because you didn't write the stove in, and then the seller doesn't leave it, but he also got a $475,000 offer accepted. So once you start modifying what the offering is, because you look at it and all of a sudden say, oh gee, as a seller, I was at 500,000, I was going to throw the stove in, but you came to me with a $475,000 offer and didn't ask for the stove or write it in. He at that point, the seller said, gee, we bargained for something different than what I advertised. And therefore, there's the exposure of not including the stove. Now, things hardwired, like AC or those types of things, is a whole different issue. But personal property that's thrown in is negotiation. Once you start negotiating price to it, and I think you still have the problem even after that. If in fact you came in with a full price offer, it's probably up for grabs. It's like anything else in the law. It's like there's two sides to the pancake.
Mike,
Yes.
this is Carrie speaking. I would just add, hi, I would add to that one caveat. That's the assumption that the stove is or other solid fuel burning device is certified and can remain in the home as part of that negotiation.
Well,
But that's to say, if it's not certified, it needs to be removed, destroyed, and disposed of, and reported to DEQ, and therefore.
no, that you're mixing. I'm sorry. I wasn't talking about wood stoves. I was talking about kitchen stoves.
Oh, okay. My mistake. My apologies.
Nope, that's okay. I missed the crossover.
Mike, I have a question for.
Yep.
I've got two computers going. My question's in the chat.
Okay. Would you share it? Oh, we lost you.
We've got two computers going here. There's feedback. That first list you worked off of, Mike, that had all those nice forms. I've got Chantel's task list. Where was that? Where do you keep that form that you started the presentation with?
It's I will have to email you because I'm not sure we have it posted anywhere other than it's on every thumb drive that we for new agents. Obviously, you're not quite a new agent.
Well,
So,
within 42 years, I am.
yeah, okay. I'll give you the one-page earnest money agreement.
Thank you, Mike.
And by the way, the forms used to be, this 11 pages used to be literally 1 or 2 pages. I can't remember, 8.5 by 14. And it said everything in that space. So you can tell, what our a series of laws have made the difference in us. And by the way, how much better the newer forms cover you. And
Yeah,
while
yeah.
we're talking about that, some people will use old forms. Part of your counteroffer is that the transaction will be rewritten on more current forms. Don't take old forms. There's all sorts of caveats in there that every year when they add stuff to the forms, they add stuff to try to protect us with both new things that are coming out and then also to sort of put their thumb in the dike and everybody's trying to break the dike down, so you keep putting your thumb in different spots to prevent leakage. So anyway, that I would just urge you to do also.
Mike, especially the property disclosure, when they give you a new form, if you've got an old one in your file, it's very problematic.
Absolutely. They change forms. And by the way, the forms property disclosure, that's not done by OREF, though it's slightly modified. It's primarily by statute, the contents of that. So as we all look at it and say, gee, I wish it was put differently or not. It's really a question of what the legislators have done to us. So we're sort of stuck with that language. I got 6 minutes to do 5 pages, 7 pages. Oops. But by the way, the first 3 or 4 are the most, probably partially the most important, the most descriptive of that. Let's talk professional inspections. couple of things on it. First, you have to call out any invasive inspections that you plan to do, right? You can check the general professional inspections to do, and then anything that's invasive, lead-based paint testing, a sewer scope, radon testing. And radon, you'd say, gee, how's that invasive? Well, first you're requiring a certain set of circumstances for the testing process. And I guess you could make the case that you're altering the air in the house by whatever little degree that is, but it's considered an invasive. And sewer scopes can be as little as just opening up the cleanup valve to inspect, to having to remove a toilet, but that should be noted. But you have to notify the seller that you're going to have those tests. If you don't, they may determine that you've already accepted it at that matter. Now, home inspections, the other thing is you have, in this particular case, by default, you have 10 business days to do the home inspection. And that's 10 business days. On that 10th day at 5 o'clock, your right to do a home inspection no longer exists, and it's deemed that unless you had some sort of other agreement, you in fact have accepted the house as is. So be careful of that 5 o'clock time frame. And by the way, while we're talking time frames, my suggestion is that when you first take an offer, get an offer accepted, that you send the other agent a list of times and dates so that everybody's in agreement how they're counting it. And more importantly, that neither of the two agents disagree, that everybody's agreeing to the same time frame, because there's number of people have different opinions. You know, is it upon delivery of the signatures of an offer, or is it based on signing and delivery? Doesn't matter. And it's actually all based on timing's all based on receipt of mutual acceptance. But I would urge you, just make sure you get the clarity up front that you and the other agent agree, and it'll save you the time an issue. If you, by that 5 o'clock deadline, you either have to have negotiated a change in that, and it has to be fully negotiated, or you need to, if you still want the house, you can just let it expire. If the repairs aren't important, or the third is that it's a do or die on the inspection request, then in fact you need to set a default, or not a default, but unconditional disapproval of the home inspection note. And that's the only way you're out of accepting it as is. So be very careful at 5 o'clock. Don't let it get down to 3:30 or 4 o'clock without a resolution. My opinion is if you're down to the last 24 hours, the day before the 5 o'clock deadline, I would go ahead and write an extension to allow buyer and seller time to negotiate. But don't box yourself into a corner. It'll drive you crazy. You'll be calling me at 4:45 or something, saying, what do I do? And there are still some things to do. So please do call me if you get to that situation.
Mike, real quick.
Yes.
Do you recommend, if you get down to the last day like that, and potentially maybe if you're not having the greatest communication with the other side, do you recommend sending a extension and a termination at the same time and just saying, please send one back or the other?
As I say, my first line of defense is to send something over the day before. Okay. That's, that sort of gives you plenty of time, puts everybody on notice. Now, it doesn't mean another agent's not going to hold you up and play the game. But having said that, try to give yourself, because in that time frame, the last thing anybody needs is to add more pressure to a pressured situation.
Okay.
So if you give somebody time and say, hey, I'm not going to get it done by 5 o'clock tomorrow, we need to have an inspection. And certain clients are easier or harder to get a hold of. I mean, we had one who had COVID-19 and was in the hospital. I mean, all of a sudden, 24 hours isn't really enough time to get that signed. So that would be my first suggestion. There are some phrasings that you could use, something along the lines of buyer and seller agree to extend the time frame till this. If buyer and seller do not agree, the buyer hereby unconditionally disapproves of the home inspection. So it's sort of it's not the best way to do it, but it's a way to get your point across.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Okay. Alternative inspections. Many a times what I like this form. It scares sellers because it 058 line lists every type of inspection that you have, and they have to check yes or no for each one of them. But the other side is it really discloses to the buyer what his option or her options are. And I think that's important. For example, what do you do if you didn't offer a sewer scope because it was a newer house, and then 2 months later their sewer backs up because it was improperly installed or something? Well, gee, you should have found that out at the sewer inspection, but you didn't suggest it to the buyer. You may have some liability there. So what you need to do is make sure that you've offered every type of inspection they have. And they can say yes or no, indifferent. I mean, sometimes they'll cut out a radon, and I'm saying, gee, are you willing to risk your life or your kid's life by not choosing a radon test? I mean, a radon test, ultimately, the result of failing could be greater than that of a sewer scope. Sewer scope, your nightmare is probably $10,000 or $11,000. You know, radon testing, by not doing that, it could be, you're really could be somebody's health. So I really, consider that an important issue to me. The health is more important. So if they're going to cut $500 out of their inspection time, they probably should cut out the sewer before they do the radon. And by the way, I in every case I always offer or suggest the radon period with it. Even in areas you'll find, well, we don't have any radon in Wilsonville, or we don't have it here or there. That's just great. You don't in general, but what if you do? Yeah, the chances are smaller, but you still could. Do it. Let's see, we've got another half a minute. There's a whole set of federal laws that on OREF 21, which talks about lead-based paint contingency. I mean, the reality is anything built before 78 most likely has lead-based paint, period. It may be under, and then people will say, well, gee, there aren't any paint chips for my kids to eat. But it's more than just paint chips. If you put a chemical on your windowsill, which is one of the places that you usually have lead-based paint, it vaporizes the paint, so you're now breathing it, and so there's a period of time that happens. The other issue is it could be if you're sanding it, you get the same issue. You're rising dust and sucking it in, and it's probably not real healthy to it. Is there anything else?
Mike, just a quick note. I always found that the lead-based paint is the only place in the sales agreement that uses calendar days as opposed to business days, and so that's something just kind of note that always threw me for a bit of a loop when I was making sense of the dates.
Yeah, Yep, it falls into a Fed law. So they've done a pretty good, they tried to do a pretty good job of making everything at 5 o'clock as all deadlines. So, and I think based on the time, I think we're pretty well done. Townhouses, we could talk about that if you have a townhouse. Remember, just remember two things. A townhouse is a style of building. A condo is a style of ownership. They're different. So you could have any style house in a condo association. I have seen, in fact, single family houses called a condo. For some reason, they had 4 houses on the end of the subdivision, and they made it part of the condo association responsible for it. A townhouse can be owned as a condo or paint in, or it could be a single family housing with attached walls. So just be careful and understand there is a difference. Just because it's a townhouse doesn't mean it's a condo. Just because it's a condo doesn't mean it's a townhouse. It has to be a townhouse. You just need to find that. Didn't get through everything, but got through most of it, or probably the big stuff that I think is important and keep you out of jail. The rest of the stuff is pretty readable. As I say, I'd go through and make sure you read it and read every page. Anybody have a question before we get on with our lives?
I've got one regarding condos and townhouses, Mike.
Yeah.
In the forms as well as in the training materials, there was quite a bit of word of caution, so to speak, around really wanting to inform your buyer or strongly encourage them to go speak to and investigate the HOA for a variety of reasons. But can you speak to kind of what you've seen as the primary issues with HOAs and why that's a red flag warning?
Absolutely, I can. There's a couple of things you should look at. First off, use the condo sales agreement. It has a series of an option of asking the seller for a series of different personal inspections. They can include, you want the minutes of the meetings. You want to make sure you have seen, and you want to go back probably 6 months, maybe even a year in meeting notes. You want to have obviously the CC&Rs, so you know what issues are involved. I always recommend talking to the president, find out what they are. If they won't give you an appointment, maybe that's not a place you want to live. Most are more than generous with their time. They just don't get asked enough. And that you should also ask for a reserve study. Reserve study talks about the financial health of the particular condo association. Do they have enough set in reserve for when the roof needs to be done? Do they have enough money set aside to do that? Or are they going to have an assessment? The minutes of the meeting you ask for the simple reason of many times you'll have some litigation that they talk about, but it hasn't proceeded enough to be of the official record. But you want to know. I mean, we had one that a tree fell on the property, and they were discussing how to pay for it and an assessment to pay for the roof damage. It wasn't written anywhere else but in the meetings of the meeting. Meanwhile, it was going to be a $10,000 assessment to each one of the homeowners. So you'll want to see all of those, review them. You know, you don't want to be the source of that information. You want to be the one that points them to, well, here's this person or this person or this person that reviews reserve studies that can help you. To answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Anything else before we depart here?
Mike, could you send the form that John requested to all of us?
Sure.
kind of the list, that would be great.
No problem. I already thought about that and have it on my list.
I have a question for you, Mike. When you're talking about being the source of the source, how much involvement do you want in like getting that information or being made aware? So for example, I wouldn't necessarily want to just send a buyer and go, oh, you need to go talk to the condo association without me being in the loop on that. Or
You can go down there with them.
get
I
it?
don't care. I don't care if you deliver them at the courthouse doorsteps.
Okay,
I want them to hear it
directly.
directly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, give me half a second. I'm just writing everybody's name down to make sure I.
Mike, it might save you some time. I think there's a participants list that should give you the list of everybody on the meeting.
Yep, that I know. I'm old school. I like it written down. Okay, we should be good. Thank you all for joining me. If you have any follow-up questions, give me a call. More than happy to sit down with you. And we'll go from there.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks. Have a great day, guys.
Thanks, Mike.
Mike.